I wanted to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where we live and work and where I live and work, and just to pay my respects to the elders, which I think is an important part of what we are doing. I think really consciously as a community, but particularly within Australia. I think the first thing you do when you try to take a culture away is by taking away its language. And so by introducing that back, particularly in an Australian context, it's a really powerful foundation for how we can kind of like untangle some of what's happened.
Thank you for that, and I wish we had a tradition of acknowledging First Nations in South Africa. I think it's long overdue.
Yeah, no, I'd really like to see that happen because I feel like, a nod to the history and all of the people that have gone before us that have allowed us the ability to be able to have the freedoms that we have in our lives right now. But it does kind of lead me to the radical. And I guess my first question was like, where did you come across the idea and when did you first meet Iman Muxing?
I think it was in about 20, I want to say 2016, 2017. I came across a small newspaper article about the Imam. He's been in the news periodically since the mid 90s, when he first came out as the world's first openly gay Imam at the time. When I read a short news piece about him, it was just instantly fascinating to me. As somebody from outside of the faith, of the Islamic faith, I had no idea that being a member of the LGBTQ community was even possible within the faith. It seemed to me that, that was a kind of very strictly conservative religion that just outright forbade that from happening in any way whatsoever. I think it was because instantly I realized that my own preconceptions were being challenged, that I thought, well, that's something interesting, and as a documentary filmmaker, my eyes and ears are always open for things like that challenge the way I thought things were, but have a completely, different perspective. And so I just kind of followed up on that instinct and found contact details for him and gave him a call and said, can I come have tea with you? Let's sit and chat. And he said, by all means, come to the mosque. I guess I was pretty upfront with him at first. I said, look, I'd love to just spend a bit of time with you and see if there's a story here that you'd allow me to tell via a documentary film. And he seemed a little bit skeptical at first. I think he's had lots of people like me approach him in the past and express interest in his story. But I kind of stuck with it and I enrolled in madrasa classes. So madrasa is in Islamic faith, usually small children who do it. And it's the classes where you learn how to pray, you learn how to write in Arabic and that sort of thing. Not that I was able to retain too much of that, but I was quite serious about learning as much as I could about the culture. And I think that sort of persuaded Imam Muhsin that, he'd let me hang around a little bit longer. And I just spent a whole lot of time with him and eventually just got used to having me around and invited me to join them for things like, breaking the fast, the iftar during Ramadan, things like dhikr on Thursday evenings, which is the sort of meditative chanting prayers that are done often on Thursday evenings. Through that process of me just wanting to learn more about something that I didn't know much about, I realized that the same would be true for many other people as well. And here was an opportunity to show a side of a religion that I grew to learn a side of that is very beautiful, that is based in strong family traditions, love for each other, for charity, all really wonderful attributes that don't gel with the kind of Islamophobic view that we often have that's in the mainstream media. I needed to acknowledge and accept my outsider status to this community. I don't claim myself as being part of the LGBTQ community as well. I would call myself an ally. But over many, many conversations with Imam Hussein, we both realized that what he was very good at doing was speaking to his community, which is the LGBTQ Muslim community, first and foremost. A lot of people know him and he's amazing at working within that community. What he was perhaps less practiced in doing is spreading that to a wider community. And I said, well, that's kind of where our interests might intersect. I'm interested in creating a film that will be eye-opening to people who are from outside of both of those communities and maybe help them to learn something and have some empathy or just insight into that. So it was a balancing act that, it's up to audiences to decide whether I got right or not, which is to amplify the voices of the communities that allowed me to work with them rather than put my own directorial voice, to be careful that it wasn't an extractive process, that I was just trying to extract stories from people for the sake of making a film. It was a process that perhaps more than any other piece of work I've gone into had to be very deliberate, very thought through, very aware of my own positionality within it, and acknowledging that both the challenges and potential upsides that that could bring.
Yeah, look, I think there's some value in the objectivity that comes from being an observer in a way that's not actually directly involved because it gives you a little bit more of a kind of almost a bipartisan view in a sense because
Sure.
you've
Yeah.
got a perspective of it that isn't quite as emotionally entangled, I think. How long did the process of the film take in the end?
So the shooting process was a solid 3 years or so, on and off. Developing the project before that was another year, and then another about a year in post-production. So, it's a project that I've lived with probably for about 5 years.
Like, did you get funding for it originally once you had the idea and approached different kind of funding bodies like Hot Docs and a couple of others to kind of see how that would kind of go and how successful were you with that at the beginning stages in terms of being able to fund the project?
Yeah, in the early stages, it was difficult. A lot of people didn't know what to do with a story like this. It's pretty unconventional. There's a lot of people who will be offended by the story. There's a lot of people in sort of more conventional Islam who will hate the story. There's a lot of people in the world who won't really engage with the story because they don't feel like it intersects with any of their own interests. There are things like I pitched it to Al Jazeera in one pitching forum, and the commissioning editor at the time, she laughed at me. She said she thinks it's a wonderful story, but there's no way they could put something like this on Al Jazeera, as liberal as Al Jazeera is in many ways. It was not the easiest film to get funded at the beginning. I think a turning point was when Hot Docs came on board. I don't have enough great things to say about the Hot Docs team. They were really, really great. And then I can encourage other documentary filmmakers to really apply. Once they believe in a project, they really kind of walk the road with you. Yes, there's funding, which helps a lot, especially when you're taking Canadian dollars and turning into South African rand. It goes a really long way, which is very helpful. But more in terms of shepherding it through the international documentary scene. And that was kind of the tipping point in getting momentum to actually get the film made. If it hadn't been for the intervention of someone like Hot Docs, I don't know if it would have been possible to really get this film made. I
I
was just going to
I
say,
think that's a really really helpful point. I think particularly for anybody who's kind of watching this from a production or filmmaking point of view, because even in Australia, there's the realm of independent documentary filmmakers, it has really kind of died in a way. There's very few really successful documentary filmmakers that can continue on in a really prolific way, and the ones that do have got 20 years of some real established groundwork. So to know that there's the options are available for that is really helpful. And I think for something like The Radical, it's a kind of a double-edged sword because at the same time as it is quite an unconventional subject matter, it's actually that is the selling point for why festivals would kind of be interested in it, because it is something that really is quite courageous, I think, to cover. What struck me maybe more so on a second viewing was the interview with the Imam Muxin goes to and sort of
mm,
kind of puts himself sort of in the firing line, really. He knew that he was going to have a really uncomfortable conversation. But that
mm.
was archival footage. It wasn't something that you filmed, correct?
Correct, yes. So there was a film made called A Jihad for Love, and I must acknowledge the director Pervez Sharma, who's done probably the most work in this kind of field where LGBTQ issues intersect with Islam. And I engaged with Pervez Sharma about the film and told him what I was doing, and didn't want to duplicate what he had done previously and wanted to focus differently on Imam Hussein, but yeah, he allowed me to use that footage in the film because it was so illustrative of what Imam Hussein used to try to do, which is, put himself in these situations and kind of go head to head. And it's what he doesn't do anymore. And he expresses that in the film as well. And it's one of the things that I needed to grapple with as well was to bring it back to the points about the funding. And I had a number of people say to me, well, I think this film would be, really interesting if you could kind of set up a debate between Imam Hussein and a more conservative Imam and let them kind of, hash it out and figure out who wins this debate to really decide what is the kind of authoritative take on what the Quran says about the acceptability of homosexuality within Islam. Yeah, I was kind of uncomfortable with the idea, and I spoke to him about it, and it was a flat no from him. He said, no, that's not what he does. It's what he had tried to do before. To set yourself up for conflict immediately says that you're not trying to find common ground. You're trying to win an argument. He refers to his work as being carefrontational rather than confrontational. As soon as I kind of realized that that's his whole take on everything he does in his life, that really influenced the style of the film a lot. And it changed the whole approach to the film, the style, the editing, everything, to something that I would like to think is quite soft, that is very beautiful in many ways, that doesn't try to hammer home its message to people, that rather invites people to listen to the message and engage with it if they'd like to.
Yeah, no, I think that's really the power of it. And I think also, I always think that when you try to fight against something, you already are going into a battle. And so you already
Mm.
know that it's going to be a war. The approach that the Imam, I think, took is definitely one that I resonated with me more, which is much more about, okay, there's probably a good chance that whatever I'm fighting against, I'm not going to win. This is what I can do. I can travel to, was it Kenya, I think, during the filming. And I found that portion of the film quite engaging, and some of the really heartfelt sort of stories that came out of that experience was also really beautiful. I think
Mm.
just because from an African context, I think, some of the stuff that feels like from a Western kind of context, we've battled maybe almost 50 years ago to some degree, and we forget that there's so many parts of the world that are still really stuck in periods of progression and human rights around, sexuality that feel for us almost alien now because it's just been such a long time since we've had that experience. That his daughter actually added a really beautiful context to his story.
Uh,
How
Atul, his daughter, yes. Mm.
yeah, yeah. How did that unfold?
That was something that emerged relatively late in the process, and it was one of those things that, as soon as it did become part of the story, I was kind of kicking myself that why didn't it come in earlier? It was only when I saw her. It's something that I filmed but didn't make it into the cut. She danced at a women's event that was held at the mosque. That's where Imam Hussein, I was standing next to him and we were watching her do her performance, with her, she was this beautiful pink costume with all these sparkly bits and all of that. And Imam Hussein said to me, I helped choreograph that dance. That for me was a little insight into his relationship with his daughter that I'd not really been aware of before. And so I started spending a little bit more time with her, and I realized that she sort of represented a lot of what I've been thinking. And that was somebody who, yes, she's Muslim, but she had had her own struggles being a feminist woman within her fairly conservative upbringing of Muslim that she had been in previously. She had a father who was openly gay, and that people had been telling her all her life was going to be stoned and killed for his lifestyle. And yet she had listened to his teaching, his take on Islam, found that it resonated for her in a way that was important and useful and inclusive, even though she wasn't part of the LGBTQ community. And that for me was a pretty key insight into realizing that, that's something that I hope anybody, regardless of their orientation or identity or faith, can take from the film, is just some insight into more compassionate ways of interpreting religion. And that also linked to something quite important. I was talking earlier about the turning points in the making of the film, and hot dogs being one of them. A second one was meeting my executive producer, who is Daniel Karslake. He's an American filmmaker. He's based in Berlin. And we started talking about what projects we were working on. And I started telling him about The Radical. And he was just gobsmacked because his work is around the intersection of LGBTQ identity and conservative Christian religion in the United States context. And he wanted to come aboard. We stayed in touch, and he eventually became an executive producer. And in practical terms, what that meant is that he tapped into a network of people, mostly based in the US, who are passionate about fighting for LGBTQ rights within a religious context. And the common thread here is that you shouldn't have to choose between being true to your faith and being true to your identity or your orientation. And anyone who's forced to choose between those things is inevitably going to have a really incredible struggle. Those are such fundamental parts of many people's identity that you're asking them to just kind of split themselves in two and choose a side. It's impossible to do in a way that still leaves you feeling intact. And so I had certain funders who came aboard that helped to get the film over the finish line, who didn't want any credit or any acknowledgement in the film whatsoever. They were just interested in pushing the agenda of helping LGBTQ identity thrive within religion, no matter what that religion was. And that was a really beautiful thing for me to see, is that, there really is cross-cultural interfaith dialogue that can happen between these religions, which, again, it's one of those sort of artificial walls that we built up between religions that hopefully this film is just one more little chip away at, breaking that wall down.
Yeah, no, I think that's so fascinating. And also I love the synchronicity of all of those kind of meetings that
Yeah.
happen. But I think it was also really nice to have these voices at the end from different, disparate
Mm.
groups that were talking about the marriage of that and some of the, conflict around it. From my own experience, sort of having a Christian upbringing, and then sort of in my early 20s, sort of realizing some of the hypocrisy around that, realizing that in order for me to have a spirituality, which I still feel quite strongly, is a part of my identity, but that it could never be aligned to a religion per se, just because I
Mm.
felt like it had been so sullied by so much of what was meant to be taught and yet was not practiced in so many ways.
Pick
Mm.
up on that if I can on one thing, just going back to kind of one of your very first questions about what motivated me to want to make this film. It goes back to, all those voices at the end, especially people in different parts of Africa who have struggled to be able to live their identity within those particular contexts. That was one of the things that also really motivated me to make this film, is that I realized that me living here in this pretty liberal little, tip of Africa, being Cape Town, it's very unlike the rest of Africa. And I take it for granted that my friends who are gay or trans or any other identity can do so pretty fearlessly here and pretty openly. And it's a freedom that I take for granted, especially given all my levels of privilege that I've been born into. And it was eye-opening for me to realize that, not very far from where I live, there's people who just don't have those freedoms. And especially if you start crossing borders into other parts of Africa, it's heartbreaking to see that that kind of conservative, oppressive nature still happens in other African countries. I thought if there's anything that I can put whatever talents or time that I have to put towards, this felt like something that was important, and a distinct part of human rights that I don't think has been addressed enough yet in Africa.
We're not free till we're all free, Richard. You know,
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like that's a very strong kind of like something that I feel really attached to in terms of this
Yeah.
idea that there's a sense that we all rise together, and that it doesn't feel right unless we're all, all kind of collectively experiencing that in some way. And I just wanted to close off with a couple of questions. Firstly, Imam Muxing, now post the film and how it's been received, it'd be interesting to find out how the film has potentially changed him, changed his life, changed some of the focus that he now has.
To be honest, it hasn't changed his life in any significant way. He still struggles for funding for his organization just to stay afloat. It's a constant struggle that he has. He relies on the generosity of various organizations that support him, human rights affiliated organizations. And it's a shame that, somebody who does the important work that he does has, it's a day-to-day struggle just to raise the money involved to help do the work he does. And it also involves, not just running the mosque, but, at various stages, they've run safe houses for people who needed to have been kicked out of their house or, just need a place to stay because of coming out. He does a lot of counseling work for people who need it. His life really is from day to day, just trying to keep that work going. From there, I think the fact that the film is traveling more and more widely and more people are seeing it, there are people reaching out to him and just being aware of his work. And, that's all we can do really is kind of keep on chipping away and hope that we're doing our little bit to create more compassion within Islam anyway and the world at large.
And if there are people who are either watching this Q&A or film that would like to do more to, maybe support him in his programs and what he does in the world, how would they go about doing that?
Compassioncenteredislam.net. But that's his organization, Compassion Centered Islam. He's on Facebook. I think he'll be found if you just Google that phrase. And that's linked to the Al Khurba Foundation, which is the name of his mosque and his particular foundation. And yeah, he can be pretty easily contacted there and supported via those channels.
Right. So compassion-centered Islam, because I think particularly
Completely.
for individuals who are, identify as being part of the LGBTQI community, that feel like that would be a good place for them to maybe get some information, and maybe, even some support. The last question I have is kind of a broader one. Do you think that there's a possibility that through, films like this and through obviously it's a huge initiative, but do you think that we could ever end homophobia and transphobia? Do you think there's a vision for how we could end that globally, and what would that look like?
I think it's a bigger question than I'm equipped to answer. What I do think perhaps we can do with films like this is just try and minimize the number of excuses that people can use to justify their hatred, their sort of prejudices. I think too often religion is used by people to justify their prejudices, where it's a choice. As we see quite clearly in Christianity, you've got a full spectrum from very liberal versions of Christianity that allow anyone to express their identity any way they wish, marry, have children, adopt children, whatever they want to do, all the way to very conservative forms of Christianity that, are anti-human rights or anti-women's rights or all sorts of things, right? And the crazy thing is that you're basing that all on the same holy text, And what I'd like films like this to do is just show that there is a legitimately compassionate, inclusive version of Islam, which is not in opposition to the religious text. It all just depends on the choices you make of what you would like to believe. And people who have got prejudice in their hearts will choose excuses like this to justify that. So hopefully through this kind of work, we can just minimize the excuses people have for their prejudice. And if people are forced to look in the mirror and say, well, there's no excuses anymore. Either I've got hatred in my heart or I've got love in my heart. It's maybe not as easy to get away with it, to face themselves.
That's such a beautiful response, actually. Thank you. Um, yeah, and I'm glad that I kind of sort of ended on that note, because it is such a big question. But I feel like it's always countered by small incremental steps. I think we can do individually and collectively. So your kudos to you and the film for being a part of that movement towards greater inclusivity and compassion and just this sense of allowing particularly us as part of the LGBTQI community to live freely and to be an expression of who we are. So thank you, Richard, and I look forward to any future films. What have you got in the works at the moment, and what have we got to look forward to?
I'm doing a lot of work for streamers at the moment, for Showmax, which has become Africa's biggest streaming service for MultiChoice Group. Any South Africans in your audience will know, Mnet and DSTV and MultiChoice and all of those channels. So currently working a lot of work for them. So projects I can't reveal just yet, but they're keeping me sufficiently overworked, which is good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really lovely to talk to you, Richard, and thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And the South African Film Festival and Ricky and you, Claire, and everyone sends their gratefulness and will thank you as well. So yeah, really appreciate your time.
Great, thank you, and thank you for programming the film. I'm really pleased to be able to bring it to more, Australian, New Zealand audiences. I hope they really
Yeah,
enjoy it.
when I first saw it, particularly last year, I was like, this is definitely getting in. I was such a great supporter of it. Just not only because of the content, but I actually felt like it was a beautifully crafted film. I thought there was a lot of thoughtfulness that went into it, and I could really feel that from the work you've done there. So
Great,
yeah,
thanks
well
so much.
done. Okay, thank you, Richard.